This podcast is for Jack London's short story To Build a Fire, which is on page 259 of your eFictions text. And this podcast should be listened to after reading the story, as there are some spoilers in what I'm about to say. So, from the beginning of the story, we see that the mood is established as being very cold and gray, as it says in the first line. And established on page 260 is that while the man, the unnamed man in the story, has some experience in this kind of a climate, this is his first winter. And being that he's thrown into these circumstances, he has limited knowledge about them, and he doesn't fully appreciate them either. And we see that every decision that he makes based on prior evidence, and he has to think through everything. But this man lacks imagination and therefore is doomed to failure if things go wrong. For instance, in the middle of page 260, it says that he is without imagination, and then that he did not meditate upon his frailty as a creature of temperature, and upon man's frailty in general, able only to live within certain narrow limits of heat and cold, and that this will become a problem later. He is contrasted with the dog, beginning on page 261 in the second paragraph. 4 lines down in that paragraph, we see this word used for the first time, instinct. And this allows the dog to know, without having to think, to simply know within its being that they should not be traveling. It is unable, of course, to identify what the temperature is by numbers. However, it knows that this is a bad idea. And it's interesting that we are, like with the lion in The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber, able to read the mind of the dog. And this is very important to the story. Over and over again, the man just thinks about how cold it is. And we see it on page 262, right in the beginning of paragraph 10. It was very cold. We see it again in the 4th line on page 263. It certainly was cold. We see it in the 15th paragraph on page 263 in the 2nd line. Once again, it certainly was cold. And we see, though, that there is a major disconnect between instinct and the dog and the man's ability to reason. So we'll be talking in class a little bit about chaos theory and complicated systems, and that in any kind of complicated system that there are so many different factors that inevitably something, if it's repeated enough, will go horribly wrong. And in the case of the man, while he is able to identify that there are dangerous areas that one can fall through to get his feet wet, while he is able to know the route to take and how to protect himself and so on, what happens are a series of things that make it so that disaster strikes. That occurs on page 264 when he breaks through, but at this point it's still just a nuisance. If everything goes right, he can warm up his feet, dry everything off, and survive, and he'll be getting, I suppose, to his friends a little bit late. But despite the warnings of the man that he thinks about back in the place of his origin, warning him not to travel, even this does not make him turn around. Even this makes him say, okay, I'm going to continue on in the journey. Then, of course, on page 266, things continue to get worse. Again, on page 267, and now he is in a mad panic and thinking to himself that the old man in Sulphur Creek was right and that the conditions are too terrible. But because he is a man, because of his hubris, he is unable to step back and wait another day until the weather conditions are better. He wants to get to his friend. He doesn't think that it'll be an issue. He's traveled this distance before. He's traveled in difficult weather before, and he does not fully appreciate the power and uncompromising force of nature. When we get to page 269, he begins to run, the dog following him at his heels. dog following him only because he hopes that the man has a better idea than the dog does. And then if we take a look at the second to last paragraph, it's paragraph 39 on the bottom of 269. This is where he has this experience in his brain that one might describe as an out-of-body experience. However, as we think about realists and naturalists compared to romantics, they would not see this as some kind of a spiritual moment or some kind of moment before death where one was being able to see himself dying or see himself the day after as his friends find him. Instead, this is just most likely hypothermia setting in, and he's dreaming, and we see the first effects of him being delusional. And he says to himself, "You were right, old hoss, you were right," referring to the old timer in Sulphur Creek who told him not to travel. And of course, at the end of the story, the dog moves on to find more fire makers and fire providers. Thanks for listening, and that's all.